Spider-Man, Spider-Man, he doesn't jump worth a Somewhat surprisingly, Spider-Man didn't land a game on the NES until 1992. Pretty late in the NES life cycle. And pretty late in Spider-Man's life cycle, as he tragically died in 1993 from an infected web hole in his wrist. Well, that's not true. That sweet Spider-Man cartoon released in 1994 really boosted Spider-Man fandom up through the early 2000s when Tobey Maguire upside-down kissed Kirsten Dunst in the rain. Aww. The Super Nintendo was already out by the time the NES got a Spider-Man game, but the good news is that the Web-Slingers video game future was in good hands with Bit Studios, who didn't develop any other NES games unless you count their port of Loops. Uh-oh. Yeah. Despite being a latecomer to the NES catalog, Spider-Man Return of the Sinister 6 didn't have a ton of promise, and lands in that bin of LJN published games that are hard to love no matter how hard you try. And trust me, I've tried. Before we get to the game itself, if you're not familiar with the comics, the game is loosely based on the story arc of issues 334 through 339 of The Amazing Spider-Man from 1990. The Sinister Six are comprised of Electro, Sandman, Mysterio, Vulture, and Hobgoblin, with Doc Ock, or respectfully Dr. Octopus, serving as the ultimate supervillain boss who wants to take over the world, yada yada yada. Is the world worth saving in this game? Let's see what's up. Spider-Man looks less like the superhero the comics and movies have cemented in our minds, and instead looks like me, wearing a Spider-Man costume. Beer gut, stubby legs, fat head, bad posture. Your abilities are limited here. You could jump. If you jump left or right, Spider-Man has to somersault, which can make things awkward. The jump in general is awkward, and does not feel very fluid, which is a real shame for a Spider-Man game. On top of that, web slinging is a real pain in the wrist, and not even utilized often enough to make it feel like a Spider-Man game. Attack webs are limited, and you have to find pickups to use them. Swinging webs are infinite, but swinging around on them is hard to get the literal hang of. The manual says you can do a 360-degree swing, but I never could get that to work, and ended up shooting my web around all willy-nilly before I could get the hang of it. The most I could get were 1 or 2 back-and-forth dangles out of each web. Thankfully, there aren't many spots where you have to use the web to traverse because it's such a hassle. But it should be a well-rounded core mechanic that works great because this is a freaking Spider-Man game. Oh well. Most of what you do is platforming through levels that are confined and claustrophobic, like caves and tunnels. Not really the types of locations where Peter Parker thrives with his web shooter. Punching and kicking is annoying. You press A once to punch. If you want to kick, you press A twice and press up on the control pad. So to do a flying kick, you don't even jump. You just press punch twice. What? The level design is pretty straightforward. In one early level, you have to find a key for a door that lets you exit the level. Where's the key? This dude has it. He's standing right in front of the door. But in another level, you have to blow up a box blocking your way, so you have to scavenger hunt for dynamite and a plunger to explode the TNT to continue. None of it feels particularly Spider-Manly. For the most part, the bosses are easier than the levels themselves. Because your attacks are pretty limited to punching and sorta kicking by accident because you're punching too fast, you really just have to stand beside the bosses and spam attacks. The difficulty kicks up on the penultimate stage where you fight Vulture on the rooftops. The whole level is tough, with tons of flying enemies and projectiles to dodge. Your inclination is to speedrun the level to get out of danger quickly, but I'm not even sure that's the best strategy, although you don't have to engage every enemy on your way through the levels, but by doing so you can build back your health, and every 1,000 points gives you an extra energy square. In all, the game is short, with a complete run taking about 15 or 20 minutes, but as it goes with these old games, you'll need a couple hours of practice to string that solid 15 minutes together. Graphically and thematically, I think the game does okay. I made fun of how Spider-Man looks, but I don't know that it's technically bad, it's just weird. The bosses look close enough to their comic book counterparts, and the environs are at least variable and interesting. The indoor levels are the most bland and repetitive looking, but the outdoor stages where you're traipsing through the city or along the rooftops have lots of color and detail. Before each level, you get a little splash screen with the next villain you'll be taking on, which does add to the comic book flavor a bit. And because the game is so short, there's no real need for passwords or saves. You will die a ton though, and you only get one continue, so be prepared to repeat the earlier levels over and over if you're motivated to beat this one. The soundtrack only has a few minutes of music, but I like the title theme okay. And overall the sound design gets a pass. But the controls feel stiff, the game is too short, and what's here can be frustrating. Graphically it gets the job done, but this is 1992 and Spider-Man we're talking about. I think we all expected and wanted a little more. At the end of the day, this one isn't turning any heads. Everything about it is too basic and unpolished to enjoy for long, and is ultimately a bland dud of an experience. If you're motivated to finish the game, you might find some fun in the challenge toward the end, but if you approach it casually, you're not likely to stick with it for long, and it won't stick with you for long. Interestingly, the only North American port of this game was on the Game Gear. It shares the same general vibe and structure, but ends up being a much shorter and much easier game than the NES one. There's also a Game Boy Color game called Spider-Man and the Sinister Six, not Return of the Sinister Six. That one is an entirely different game. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color were home to their own series of Spider-Man games, and the generation of consoles following the NES was home to a handful of games that vary in presentation and quality quite a bit. Spider-Man was paired with Venom for a couple of games, joined forces with the X-Men for a weekend, and even had one based on that aforementioned animated series. Well, that's going to do it for Spider-Man Return of the Sinister Six on the NES. As always, don't sling your web all willy-nilly, and thanks for watching.